trouble began in Montreal. The quiet revolution was beginning to be not so quiet. It was beginning. Right through the post-war years in Quebec, there had been an increasing activity on the labor front. And unions were being formed in industrial Montreal. And the attitude towards unions was very different in Montreal from English Canada. In Montreal, as in France, syndicalism was entirely respectable not just among workers, the industrial proletariat or whatever you want to call it, but also among professionals, associations. There were syndicals with bargaining rights, so that artists, writers, professionals of all kinds formed unions, that was not done in English Canada, where it was really a matter of a class matter. So the television producers in Montreal, where television began, as in Toronto in 1952, wanted to form a union. They felt they had all kinds of grievances. That was not so in Toronto. In Montreal, there was class warfare, class in the sense of the producers, from the beginning. And there were a number of villains among the management whom they hated. So there was trouble. And in 1958, I think, they decided to form a union, and management said out of the question. And the public sympathy was entirely with the producers, because it was in the air. Everybody was forming a union. But management in faraway Ottawa, far away from Montreal, and far away psychologically, management took the view out of the question, because the producers are managers. The producers have a budget. The producers spend money, and therefore they can't be workers. And the producers, so a war began. And in the fall of 1958, the producers decided to strike. It was a most dramatic and painful strike. It lasted, I think, 66 days or something like that, until the next spring, in free picket lines in a very cold winter. And it was highly emotional and very ideological. And the intelligentsia, if I may call them that, was entirely on the side of the strikers. Poor old CBC management had no friends. Everybody was in favor of the strikers. The press, everybody. Trudeau was a professor of law at the University of Montreal, and he supported the strike. He had had a skiing accident, and he broke his ankle or something. And he took a taxi to the picket line 2 or 3 times to give his support. He was already quite well known, but it was long before he was a politician. But the major figure and the interesting one was René Lévesque. René Lévesque, who had been a radio personality, a television personality, in a program called Point de Mire, M-I-R-E, Point de Mire. It was an extremely successful broadcaster. It was a one-man show. It was him talking into the camera the way I do to you now. He had a map in that ahead of him, and he played around with the map and chalk and whatnot. He was a great talker, and everybody was watching him. Right in the 50s, he was not interested in Quebec politics. He was interested in the world. He was interested in the Americans. He loved American conventions. He loved American politics. He was not a great Quebec politician. Yet, not yet. But that strike radicalized him. That strike, he was furious with CBC management. He was a personality. He was furious with them. He said, he made a public statement towards the end of the strike. He said, if this was English Canada, he said, the strike would have been solved in 2 days. But here they let us sit under the freezing pickline for half a year. And why? Because the CBC is run by English Canadians. So they sent delegations to Ottawa. The poor old president of the CBC, who happened to be French, Alphonse Ouimet, was out of commission. He had a heart attack. Not over this. He was ill. So the man who had to deal with the strikers was Ernest Bushnell, a very nice man, but didn't speak a word of French. Had no relation to the French. Had no feeling for it. Had no feeling for it. It was a French-English war. It was not only a class war within a society. It was beginning to be very nasty. And it radicalized René Lévesque, and it was no doubt a major factor in Lévesque entering the political arena. Anyway, the CBC lost that strike. The union had to be formed. The only condition was that they could not join, the producers' union could not join whatever it was, that the greater Quebec Union, the CBC said, that would deprive them of the necessary impartiality and neutrality if they were part of the labor movement. So they were allowed to form a union. They've had a union ever since, and that was that. However, it had been so nasty. There was violence. There was families were split up over the strike. So when I arrived in Montreal, 1971, the wounds had not yet healed. There was still talk about people who did not support the strike, who were ostracized. And it was a very nasty. Okay, that's Montreal. In Toronto, a few months later, in June 1959, there was something similar, but much less emotional and much less difficult. And that was a strike in which I was involved. No, it wasn't a strike. It was not a strike. It was, let us say, an activity. It was not a strike because we were not, no union was involved. And this is what happened. There was a new prime minister called John Diefenbaker, a Tory from the West. And he, from the very beginning, made it quite clear that he was not very fond of the CBC. And there was a program called Preview Commentary after the 8 o'clock news in the morning, for a 5-minute commentary every morning after the news, and in which my department, Talks and Public Affairs, administered very carefully chosen political talks from various members of the press gallery, usually the press gallery in Ottawa, carefully balanced, so many liberals, so many CCF, so many conservatives, and then the 2 or 3 outsiders. And it was very, very conscientiously run. And John Diefenbaker, new Prime Minister, who, there were 2 elections, 1958 and 1959. 1959, he had a landslide. He had a very strong position. And in the morning, when he was shaving, he listened to the radio and he heard talks he didn't like. More than once. Didn't like it. So he made it known. It's very complicated, and I'm not sure whether anybody ever found out how this worked. He talked to his minister, who was Mr. Nolan from Halifax, through whom the CBC reported to Parliament, and he probably said to him, get hold of phone the president of the CBC and tell him to get that program off the air. Or else. The or else is always very important, because it always meant that they'd cut the money, they'd cut the budget, or do something terrible. So this was conveyed to the CBC, and the CBC said, the president again was away, it was Bushnell. Well, we are in some danger, we might lose him. We'd better take that program off the air. And they conveyed this to Frank Pierce, my boss, and they said to him, take that program off the air. And my boss, Mr. Integrity, Mr. Probity, the guardian of virtue and conscience, whose very essence was not to yield to government interference, said, this is out of the question, this is government, this is clearly exactly the kind of thing which must not happen. And so he went to Ottawa, and he demanded an explanation from his bosses, and they said, it's a fait accompli, we've made that decision. So he said, well, I have absolutely no choice, I have to resign. And so this was the whole department, the whole national department, from coast to coast, the various public affairs people, producers, resigned, about, I think, 35. We all resigned, and this was not a strike. We had no union, there was not a strike. We resigned from the corporation. This was a major decision. We all had, I was typical, one wife, children, mortgages, no other sources of income. We all sacrificed our worldly existence for a principle. And the principle was the integrity of the CBC, freedom of speech. The press supported us overwhelmingly. It was a great, big, huge story. It seemed to be, it was one of those easy stories, who was right and who was wrong, and management was wrong. And we were right. We were all... So the thing didn't last very long. The board, which first supported Mr. Bushnell, and then reversed itself. And after, I think, a week or 10 days, we all lost a week's salary. We were reinstated. The world applauded. We felt very, very good about ourselves. And our leader, Frank Pierce, was promoted as a result. It was one of those very rare, successful moves in a big institution. And we were very, very pleased and self-satisfied. However, it did not last very long until there was very serious conflict again between labor, if I may call it that, and management 5 years later, and that I will talk about next time.